Hey everyone, welcome back to another edition of That's Our Two Satoshis Live, where we talk about what's happening in the digital asset market. For those not familiar, we've been writing about the digital asset markets here at ARCA for almost 6 years now, since inception of our firm. We have a blog, ar.ca/blog, where we write an article, That's Our Two Satoshis, that comes out every Monday, talking about various aspects of the digital asset market. But we've been a little on hiatus for a couple of months here with the live stream, so we're happy to be back again, and we'll be doing this again every week as well. I'm Jeff Dorman, Chief Investment Officer at ARCA. Normally, I'm the author of all of these That's Our Two Satoshis, but this week I was on vacation, and it was a good time to be on vacation because I turned it over to two people much smarter than me, my own research analyst and friend Nick Hote, as well as special guest Sami Kassab from OSS Capital, former Masari. And it was a good time to turn it over to you guys because one of the best tokens of the last 9 months and one of the coolest projects of the last year related to AI, Bittensor, came under attack. And it's always funny when things come under attack because I don't know who they're attacking or what the point of it is. But you guys came to the rescue of not really investors, but more so the project in terms of dispelling some of the criticism. In my opinion, some of it was fair, some of it was completely inaccurate, and you guys did a really good job of dispelling that. So rather than listen to me talk, let me turn it over to you guys. What happened? Why is there so much division within the Bittensor world, and what was fair criticism versus what was nonsense?
Yeah, so Bittensor has always been, I think, a bit of a controversial project. Just something that started off as a grassroots launch, fair launch. There was never any investors or private sales or anything. So just by that nature, it kind of doesn't really have the ability to market itself like a lot of other projects do. And so as a result of that too, I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about how it works, what it is among the investor community. So over the weekend, we had a bunch of investors kind of who I think were misinformed on a fair amount of the actual like operations of how it works, kind of making the case that because of one of the applications that build on Bittensor, not making sense to them, that this entire project was worthless and it didn't really make sense for as like an AI application. So, the first criticism was really operational, and it was about one of the subnets on Bittensor, which is kind of like one individual application out of 32 that are currently available. And this particular one was subnet one. I guess, Sami, would you be able to like walk us through what the actual criticism was and why it didn't really make much sense?
Yeah, so I think what's important to just explain first off, which was a big cause of the confusion, was just kind of the architecture of Bittensor and how each subnet is essentially its own sandbox, right? Where a team can decide, how they want to structure the incentives, how they want specific miners and validators to act. And so what had happened in this thread by Eric Wall, who's calling out Bittensor, was that he kind of looked at subnet one, and then his understanding was like, okay, the whole entire network is architected this way, which was immediately false, right? And so as he was looking into subnet one, his takeaway was that this subnet was essentially just a chat bot, which was incentivizing miners to all respond to the same query from a validator. So like as a validator, I'm kind of the middleman of a network. A user would send a response to me, and his understanding was then the validator would send the response to each miner on the network, and there's about 1,000 miners on this subnet, and they would all send back their responses, and that there was this like crypto economic security mechanism that would enable the verifiable responses, which was false. And so what people don't understand about Bittensor is that the way that the UMA consensus mechanism, or that the validating mechanism works, is that the only responses from validators that get sent to the entire mining network within each subnet are the ranking or evaluating queries. And so for any user generated query, it's on the miner to decide, or it's on the validator to decide, who they want to route that job to and how they want to route it to. And so one of the main critiques that this person was making was that it's highly inefficient, right? And of course, it is highly inefficient to send one inference to 1,000 miners. That's not the case here, right? But more importantly, subnet 1, and I know, Nick, you and I, to be fair, we're pretty confused on like the exact objective of subnet 1. And so I can't really blame people who are criticizing this subnet, because just the nature of it is highly complex. But essentially, like, it's not just acting as this decentralized inference network where people can build chatbots on top of. It's really incentivizing like a specific objective, which is fast retrieval. And so without getting too into like the ML jargon and like RAG systems, essentially they're just incentivizing these miners to respond with the fastest and most accurate answer. And so that was something that clearly got overlooked as well. And again, I can't really fault the person because we were kind of learning also about that subnet. And so I'd say like those two were probably the biggest points that thread got wrong. And it was kind of what that whole critique was centered on as well, right? So like right off the bat, the critique really didn't stand.
Yeah, no, that's a super helpful explanation, and I think that was just part of the overarching argument was just this inefficiency claim that hey, you're routing to 1,000 different miners whenever you send a query to this ChatGPT clone, and you have everybody respond basically the exact same thing to you, which is not really the case. It's actually in a lot of ways superior potentially because you can route to many different models. Whereas if you're ChatGPT, just routing to GPT-4 or whatever. But in the case of Bittensor, they don't care what model they're routing to. They can say, okay, we'll take DALL-E, we'll take ChatGPT, or GPT-4, we'll take whatever Anthropic made and Llama and anything, and you can just pick and choose what you think is going to be best for the situation as a validator. So just the potential there makes it a lot more open and available and potentially better for the user over the long term.
Yeah, and to your point, because the miner is only responding with an output and isn't sharing their entire model, it allows miners to use proprietary models on the network. And so we could talk later about like how some of these subnets enable validators to launch like monetizable services and products on top, but it also enables miners to like monetize closed source models, right? And so like within subnet 1, for example, if some AI lab had developed this really strong model that just had this killer retrieval speed, they could contribute it to the network. People could benefit from it without it being open sourced, and that miner could just be making money from doing so.
Yeah, that's really good, and I think it leads into a bit of one of the other points that we wanted to bring up, that subnet 1 is, it's really not the only focus of the Bittensor network, that there are many different applications here, and that potentially like just one application, even if Sammy and I don't fully understand it, there are other applications here that do make a lot of sense, and that we see the value of. And so maybe, we classified these different applications into different categories. Would you maybe want to go through the first category, the public good category, and some of the projects that you see that are interesting building there?
Yeah, so it was really the news research subnet that kind of solidified this framework in my head. But so essentially how we categorized these subnets was two categories: a public goods subnet and then a validator service subnets. And so I'll talk about the public goods subnets first. And the way I'll do that is by explaining what News Research is doing with their subnet. So just real quick to preface that, open source initiatives in general have just faced challenges because of the lack of like funding and incentives associated with that. And so the open source AI space really just has to rely on like, good actors or contributors who are just doing this like out of the goodness of their heart to open source some of these models. And so that alone really just kind of, I would say, decelerates the growth of open source AI, especially when it's trying to compete with these closed source actors. But going back to subnet 6, so the Noose research team created the subnet, which essentially incentivizes these developers and engineers to fine tune open source LLMs. And essentially what they're trying to do is create this open source fine-tuned LLM that can be on parity with GPT-4's performance and outputs. And the way it does that is by using synthetic data that is created from another subnet that we can get into. But that subnet is basically aggregating synthetic data from GPT-4. And then subnet 6 is using this synthetic data as a way to benchmark miners. And so long story short there is these miners are incentivized to create these fine-tuned open source LLMs that hopefully or eventually will be at the same quality and performance as GPT-4. And what was interesting though about this subnet is that, so like say I'm a miner who's training this or fine-tuning this model. In order for me to receive rewards and prove that like I've created a model that outperforms all the other competitors on the network, I need to share that model, which includes like the weights, with the validators. And so the way that this subnet does that is by forcing miners to upload their model to Hugging Face, in which case the validators would go to Hugging Face, pull the model, benchmark it, and if it truly does have the lowest loss, or like, it's most similar in quality to GPT-4 compared to the other models, then that miner receives the majority of the rewards. And so what was interesting about this is that, like,
summarize that real quick,
yeah,
so everybody knows where we are. Like, so essentially what you're saying is they've created this system that feeds ChatGPT responses into their models. And right now, the open source models that they're using aren't as good as like ChatGPT. But if they can continuously feed this new information into their models, then they can make it eventually catch up to where ChatGPT is.
Exactly. And so, yeah, the system's architected to incentivize these open source models to catch up to GPT-4. And so going back to what I was saying about how the models that they're creating being fully open source and published on Hugging Face, there really is not an opportunity or an incentive for validators to validate that network besides earning the emissions. So like there is no service that a validator could offer on top because the models are already like fully open sourced. And so the way I was thinking about this is like essentially this is you could think of it as a public good in which other subnets that might want to utilize the models that are coming out of subnet 6 could fund this subnet, whether it's through validators that are on that subnet allocating it emissions, or in other ways. And so that might be a little confusing, Nick. Let me know if we need to dig into anything else, but that's kind of like the high level idea, is that these subnets are really just intended to accelerate open source AI, and the outputs and like models generated are then plugged into other subnets, which allow validators to build these monetizable goods and services on top. And that's kind of the second category, which I can hand off to you, Nick, if you kind of want to run through and explain that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that last sentence that you were getting at, that you said these are accelerators. And that's kind of how I think about it too. These are like, you've got these public good subnets, which are like Y Combinator, startup things. They're not actually like making a profit. They're just investing in this infrastructure, and then you're eventually able to move that on and migrate that information, that infrastructure into something monetizable. And that's where the validator service subnets come in. So these are the ones where you actually have a good or service that they're producing and selling either B2B or B2C. And the way Bittensor works is you have these miners creating some sort of intelligence, and then the validators are the only ones that can get access to that, because the miners get more tau emissions when they respond to the biggest and the most trusted validators. So if you're one of those, you get the best access to miners. So one particularly good example, I think, of this validator service subnet is PTN, the proprietary trading network, which is on subnet 8. So this is a subnet that essentially asks miners to make profitable trades in financial markets. So they've got Forex, they've got crypto, and they've got equities currently. And they say, hey, just choose an asset and go long or short that asset, and then eventually close it out, and we'll see how you did. And then they judge them on their returns over the last 30 days. The ones that draw down 10% get weeded out, and the ones that do the best get the most emissions going forward, to basically create this like self-improving system that is just able to create market signals that are winning signals. So this is something that obviously, as a validator, if you have access to a profitable signals, that's something valuable. You can either trade on that yourself or package those signals and sell them to someone else. Another pretty critical point, though, is that if you have access to all the miners, you can also say, oh, well, this miner is saying long euro, and so is this one, and so is this one. So now I can be 3 times as convicted or whatever that this is actually a good trade. And so I can have my own sort of algorithm that determines among the whole landscape of miners, how good of an idea is this? I could even like design a portfolio with it. There's a whole bunch of stuff you can do. And so the individual validators also have this mechanism where they can kind of create their own brand, their own moat of profitability as well. And so I think, to me, that's where it really, like, the rubber hits the road for Bittensor is, okay, hey, this is bringing the value into the real world. We're no longer just in this reflexive crypto circle. These are like real things that you can sell, sell an API access or access to these signals or whatever, and somebody will actually pay for that. And we're not there on almost every subnet. Almost all of these are still pre-revenue, not to say not even just pre-earnings. But you're definitely seeing real businesses come into the space and find value. I mean, one product that we've liked is Kaido. They're great with they've got awesome analytics for the crypto markets, and they're building a subnet on Bittensor. Sammy mentioned Noose Research, who's been one of the leaders in the OpenAI and crypto kind of intersection space. Some other ones recently as well, like MyShell, that have come on, who are kind of big in the space, as well as Wombo, who does more of like text to image generation. They've been very popular on the App Store as well. So starting to see these like real businesses find value in it. And I even talked to the Kaido team and say, yeah, we think we can definitely reduce costs, expand our business by doing this. I guess just maybe kind of starting to
Let me jump in for a second. I mean, you guys are definitely addressing a lot of the positives. Clearly you mentioned that the original author of some of the Bittensor FUD had a incorrect premise, but did he make any, or did other people make any fair critiques at all, even if the premise of the initial critique was wrong? And what are some of those fair critiques?
Yeah. I can hit on the validator component. So I think that the most fair critique that I had heard to date is that the validators are this responsible for determining emissions across the subnets. So they get to choose which subnets get emissions. And right now the validators are, it's a pretty centralized group of people. So just, as a result of that, you can get a lot of issues with, unfair play, self-dealing, things like that, where the people who have the ability to allocate capital can also allocate to themselves or to their friends, etc. So this is something that didn't really have a clear plan up until a few months ago. The foundation, or some contributors from the foundation, introduced a proposal called dynamic tau, which basically creates a market mechanism for determining the emissions rather than having the validators do it. There's still definitely details to iron out. They don't have the full idea fleshed out, and we're a long way away from that actually being implemented still. But I think the overall idea should eliminate that. But again, nowhere near in production, and that's definitely an issue right now.
Yeah, and I'll add another critique I've started to hear more about, which is regarding the incentive system, or you could say the reward structure. So I guess it's actually more attributed to the validation mechanism, but a lot of subnets are using centralized models at this point in time to basically push the miners to, like, keep achieving like better and better results, but also in evaluating these miners' responses. And like for now, this works well because open source AI is still, like Nick said, catching up to closed source AI. So like for now, you can use centralized models to get to the same like level, to basically level the playing field between open source and closed source AI. Once the Bittensor open source AI community like reaches parity, now you have to come up with new validation mechanisms which can push the boundaries. And it's going to become more difficult to evaluate, like how do you know which miner generated a better response if you no longer can use GPT-4 to determine it, because you don't have like a frame of reference now on like which is best. And so it's a bit of like maybe like an academic or scientific problem, but it's not to say that there aren't people in the community that are already thinking about solutions to these questions. One proposal that I've heard is integrating like human feedback into the evaluation loop. So similar to how like GPT-4 was trained, with like humans basically saying like this output is better than that output, and that's how the model got progressively better. And so there's a proposal suggesting that, but like in reality, I think it's a solvable problem right now. There really isn't a heavy focus because it's not necessary, but I would say that's probably the critique that I've heard that holds the most weight at the moment.
And it's interesting. I think industry tends to operate in the extremes a lot, and you very rarely hear somebody say, "Hey, it's a good project, but there's a couple things to work on." You just say, "Oh, if there's one flaw, then it's a terrible project. It's a scam. It's useless." I think there's a huge gap and a huge difference between something that has no real future and doesn't work, or is a scam, or is just a broken project, versus something that's clearly impactful, clearly doing something well, but has some rough edges that need to be smoothed out. I mean, these are still all early stage companies. They're not going to get it right on the first iteration. And there's nothing wrong with finding your flaws as you go and fixing them along the way. So I think it's pretty evident for those who know this project that this is definitely in the latter camp, right? Good project, really solving real problems, but has some work to do. And I think people certainly love debate, certainly love hearing the opposite side of the spectrum, but people need to be careful labeling something a scam or labeling it a useless project or useless token just because it's not a perfect project or token.
Yeah, something that Nick and I can both vouch to is the amount of time that it takes to really understand Bittensor, which has its drawbacks, right? From like your average person being able to understand it, but why I think a lot of people jump to conclusions on just saying like Bittensor is useless or just like a meme coin is really because they don't understand UMA consensus. And like when you talk to like the co-founders, they all will always come back to like UMA consensus is that core innovation that enables Bittensor to do what it's doing. And without going into much detail or like getting into the technicals, Bittensor is essentially, or Yuma consensus has essentially enabled like a non-deterministic compute network. Every other blockchain, deterministic, right? Like validators are just computing the state transition functions. Validator A should get the same output as validator B. When you're dealing with neural networks, it's not deterministic. If you and I are both using ChatGPT, we both put in the same input, we're both going to get a different output. And so if you're doing distributed and decentralized AI, you need this new mechanism for validators to come to consensus on non-deterministic applications. And I don't see anybody discussing that like within Bittensor, or I mean, that's like critiquing Bittensor. And like that's the main innovation, right? And that's what's enabling all these applications to appear on top. And so I really just think sometimes like from like the critiques I read, it's pretty clear to me that these people haven't done their homework. While some of their critiques like are valid from people who have studied and researched the network, I just think this is one of those projects where you need to put in the work, you need to put in the time, and yeah, once you do, it'll kind of become evident.
Well, and don't forget too that the venture capital community in general tends to not slam projects that have venture investors, right? They don't want to piss off other investors. They don't want to become the fund that doesn't get the look on the next project because whereas it's really easy to slam something like Bitcoin where there were no, necessarily seed investors and there is no seed. It's really easy to slam something like Bitcoin where there's no venture investors because it was a fair launch. So it's also, that's just the nature of sometimes when you create a token or a project where you don't need the venture community, it's much easier for them to say, oh, well, if I wasn't needed, then you suck. So, definitely be mindful of the people who are slamming a project and whether or not they are fairly criticizing other projects as well, and not just the ones where there's no investment. So I think we're running up on time here. This has been great, guys. Any final conclusions or any final thoughts here that people know here about either the project itself or some of the criticism, some of your bullishness around it, given the last couple of weeks of online activity?
Nothing really from me. We included a couple links to some more overviews of the project. There was also another really good one, Twitter Spaces, that I retweeted yesterday. So if you're interested in learning more, you can find it pretty close to the top in links within our piece, or check out Mog Machine on Twitter, his Twitter Spaces the other day or yesterday, that are all really good overviews of the project.
Yeah, and I would just echo what Nick has said. I'd say if you're interested, also check out bittensor.com, which is like the landing page the foundation created. There's a great non-technical paper that basically goes through kind of the overall goal and vision of Bittensor, which for me really helped in my understanding. So I think that's a great place for people to start. And then, yeah, definitely check out some of the resources that Nick described.
Terrific. Well, this is great. For those listening, you can obviously follow more of Arca's writings and musings on our website, ar.ca/blog, where if they want to talk specifically about Bittensor with you guys, where can they reach you guys individually?
So I'm on Twitter at old_Samster.
Great Twitter handle. I'm on Twitter at Nick_Hotes.
Terrific. Well, Sammy, you're always welcome back. We'd love to hear your thoughts on other parts of the crypto world as well. Thank you both for writing this week and speaking about Bittensor, and we'll look forward to doing it again next week. So thanks everybody for joining. Appreciate it.
Thanks for